We're looking at learning objective 5, which is to classify compounds as ionic or molecular, which is also called covalent. So ionic compounds are formed from ions. There are two types of ions. You have the cation. This is positive. And the anion, which is negative. Now, when we form an ionic compound, the cation and the anion's charges cancel one another. So the charges cancel. Okay. So these guys can contain, so like if I'm actually looking at these guys, they can contain metals, nonmetals, as well as polyatomic ions. So polyatomic ions. Okay. These guys have what is known as a lattice structure. So that, which is a 3D structure that repeats. So when we have the lattice, we have a lot of the actual like unit for these. The smallest particle in this, or the base unit, is known as the formula unit. Okay, so the formula unit, this is the smallest particle of the base unit, or the base unit. The reason it's a formula unit is, again, the 3D structure repeats. So like you've got this lattice structure that's repeating regularly. And because it's repeating regularly, you have a lot of those atoms that are in together. So then we call the smallest piece of that the formula unit. Okay. So then let's look at molecular compounds. So molecular or covalent compounds. These guys are formed from only nonmetals. So only nonmetals. So we don't have any metals, not metals. No metals are in a molecular compound. So these do not contain polyatomics or metals. These have what is known as a molecular structure, not a lattice. So these guys don't have a lattice structure. Molecular structures don't actually repeat. So the molecular structures don't repeat or connect together. So they can connect together in a certain type of force, but they're not actually bound together. So when I say they're not connected together, they're not bound. So again, molecular structures don't repeat or connect together. They're not bound together. The smallest particle, or the base unit for a molecular compound, is a molecule. So molecule, this is where we get the mole, which we'll talk about in the next chapter. So something to remember, metals. So if I have a metal or I have a polyatomic, remember this means 3 or more elements. It is always ionic. Always. And if it starts with a nonmetal, it's most likely molecular. Again, the only exception is if I've got 3 or more elements. So let's look at some examples here. Ionic and molecular. So examples for identifying molecular or ionic. So let's look at some examples here. I've got CO, right? So C, lowercase o. Let's go to my periodic table. See if I can find CO. So CO is right here. So I've got it right here. It's number 27 on the periodic table. This would be considered a transition metal. So this guy is a metal. Well, I know if I start with a metal, then it's definitely ionic. So this guy's ionic. So the next example I have is Cl4. Again, go to my periodic table. Oh, I've got carbon right here. It is a nonmetal because this is where the metals are separated from the nonmetals, that little staircase right there. So carbon is definitely a nonmetal. So this is molecular. This guy. Again, we've kind of talked about this already, but this would be considered a nonmetal. But it depends on if it's got AQ or if it's got gas. Okay. AQ would be considered a ionic compound, and a gas would be considered a molecular compound. So it depends on what state of matter this one is in, because this would be considered an acid if it's aqueous, and hydrogen chloride if it's a gas. Okay. So then I have Mg. This is magnesium, which is a metal. So this is definitely ionic. And then I have SO2. S is definitely sulfur. So this is a nonmetal, which is molecular. And this is starting with nitrogen, which is a nonmetal. However, I have 1, 2, 3 elements. So again, if I have more than 3 elements, one of those things is coming from the polyatomic ion sheet, which is right here. So ammonium is NH4. It's coming from the polyatomic ion, so that means it is an ion, which is ionic. Cu is copper, which is a metal. So this guy is ionic. So this part is ionic. And then this part would be considered molecular. That's learning objective 5, to classify compounds as ionic or molecular. So you're going to need to be able to, when given a compound, tell me if it's ionic or molecular.